On today's World Insight, big trouble over the sale of TikTok's U.S. operations, with a lawsuit against the ban, new China rules on tech exports, and a looming sale deadline. What's next for the popular social video app? And scathing words from a longtime American China hand on Trump policies with China. The full interview with David Lampton in tonight's Pathfinder.
What the costs of bad U.S. China relations can be. Enormous.
Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei in Beijing. We begin today's program with TikTok ban story in the U.S. Lately, it has been the biggest source of tension between Beijing and Washington. President Trump from the U.S. signed an executive order on August the 6th, giving TikTok 45 days to cut ties with its Chinese parent company, ByteDance. It effectively set a deadline for a sale of the app's U.S. operations to an American company. Meanwhile, China published new export rules that added civilian use to a list of technologies restricted for export, including algorithms used in platforms like in TikTok. That means ByteDance, the parent company of TikTok, will need to comply with the approval procedures under the new rules in China. So, a lot of players already on the ground. What's next for this popular video sharing app that has 800 million active users around the world who are using them for fun? So, let's talk to our panelists for some serious discussions. For more on U.S. and TikTok, we are joined in Shanghai Lu Chuanying, Research Fellow at the Shanghai Institute for International Studies. In Bangkok, Jeffrey Towson, Professor from Guanghua School of Management, Peking University. And in New York, via Zoom, Max Wolf, Managing Partner at Multivariate. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. There are minute-to-minute development of the latest deals or no deals. Let's focus not necessarily on every step of the way of the negotiations, but on some of the bigger issues. Mr. Wolf, how should we understand the latest development regarding technology, particularly algorithm, which recently has become the most important topic, it seems, in this deal?
Well, certainly the AI, the development of AI, which is very much a sort of China and U.S.-centric story right now, although there are some other important geographies in that business, has kind of come to the fore, although I do think it's a bit of a rationalization for a policy decision that isn't all that clearly rooted in either science or national interest from the U.S. here, but all that's come to focus first on Huawei, which made a little more sense, although not that much, and now on TikTok, which it does appear to some extent that the President of the United States is trying to interfere both in the operation of a foreign subsidiary here and also in the process of figuring out who buys the assets at a fire sale he arranged with the sudden interest in Oracle, et cetera. So I think it's a dangerous precedent, but I do think there's a big global competition over AI, and that competition is probably healthy, and AI is certainly going to have a growing role in our lives next week, next month, next year.
Absolutely. Mr. Lu in Shanghai, tell me more about, after China's announcement of the, shall we say, security of tech transfer, new rules, we have heard from some of the presidential advisors from the White House talking about that there's going to be banning of further and many more Chinese-made apps. Where are we going?
We are talking about the WeChat, for example, is not the traditional area. For example, like it's not a state-owned company. It's completely a private company. And it's also an international company because the biggest owners is not Chinese, it's a South Africa organization. So it's very complicated situation for the White House to directly to banning the so-called Chinese app. Actually, it's not just be defined as the pure Chinese,
It is very
or
interesting.
traditional
It's the same thing, same logic
companies.
with TikTok, isn't it? It's not mainly the Chinese investment. It's an investment coming from some of the major financial groups and also investment banks. Mr. Towson.
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of a strange situation because it's about the U.S. and China, right? This is a political discussion from top to bottom. And at the center of this is a company that's a pretty simple, I mean, it's a short video company. You watch 15-second videos of people dancing in their bedrooms, right? The company itself is not, I mean, the Trump administration has said this is a national security concern. That's a hard stretch to get from dancing kids to national security. And then the export control is the argument coming out of China. That makes, I think, more sense because at least there are algorithms. But I think this is still 80% about the U.S. and China. It's a political discussion. And TikTok just seems to be stuck in the center of this. To some extent, the same way Huawei was, you know, part of another discussion related to technology. So it's mostly about that relationship, and then TikTok is kind of getting bounced around in the middle of this.
Are we, in a way, Professor Wolf, encouraging scientific innovation and technological innovation, or, you know, the apparent Cold War between China and the United States, at least some say in the tech area, has discouraged the spread of the technology and also the betterment of the use of technology, applications of technologies?
A lot of our technology comes from investments and techniques and research that comes out of our university system, and not having access to the students of the world, which particularly this year we don't, is creating financial ruin for some colleges, and also meaning that the brightest kids can't go to the best labs and learn the most important skills and work together. So the promise of the internet, on which all of this is based, is the promise of global instantaneous communication. And the United States is busy in business lately, unfortunately, building walls, and walls that prevent the most talented people from winning markets, walls and interventions that prevent people from going and studying and working together. It's kind of sad. And if the prevention of collaboration has come to the point where we are afraid to let people watch videos of each other playing with their pets, it seems pretty outrageous. And I feel like I have to add one funny thing here, which is the United States government is begging Chinese exporters for masks, gloves, and sanitizer, which are apparently not national security, but are afraid of kids dancing and sending videos to each other, which apparently is national security. So I think we've also reached a kind of surreal moment here in our international policy, just as an American state.
What's going to happen to technology development? What's going to happen to applications of technologies? What's going to happen to policies regarding technologies? All these are very important issues. It's really deciding our fate as a whole in the near future.
Right. Within the U.S.-China relationship, I mean, this started out as a trade discussion. Everyone was talking tariffs 2 years ago. And then it became a technology discussion, Huawei, TSMC. And I think this latest round is more about media than it is about technology. I mean, TikTok is not really a tech company. It's a media company. That's why it's culturally important. That's why it's politically important. So we are seeing sort of different aspects of this discussion. I don't think a lot of what we're seeing right now with TikTok is going to apply to technology generally. This is not about e-commerce. It's not about logistics. It's not about people buying stuff online. It's mostly about media and social media right now between the U.S. and China.
So, Mr. Liu, what about some of the questions I raised regarding the future of tech and about the global applications of tech? Is this the sign of something to come? Should we all, not only in China, but also we all prepare for something?
What we are talking today is not traditional tech, it's the emergent technology. It's so important, right? So we have this trend of nationalization or put a lot of the national security concerns on this emergent technology. But globally speaking, what we are seeing today is a state are more emphasized on their technical sovereignty, not just China, not just U.S. But we also see that the European Unions, they published a couple of the reports emphasized on the European Union's digital or technology sovereignty. And the second trend is domestically in China. So, in past we buy or we cooperate with the foreign companies like U.S. companies to buy their technologies. But right now, a lot of people in China realize that this way will not, be in the future. So it's going to be changed, and you have to rely on yourself. So it's going to be a very dramatic, change in China in technical policies.
What does that mean? That every country has become their own island in a way, whether it's innovation, technological development, application, and eventually the use of it by consumers. How is it going to be different from what we are seeing right now in the world? Mr. Townsend, is it going to be a dramatically different picture, and it's going to be a dramatically different world?
I think this is the real risk for China in particular, that there is going to be a temptation to sort of de-internationalize and focus back home on the domestic market, which is quite large. And we've seen Huawei do that a lot in the last 6 months. The problem there is you risk becoming a little bit like the Galapagos Islands, where you have very interesting creatures within China, but they don't work anywhere but here. And that's kind of what's happened with Japan's tech scene, is the digital creatures, the technology, they only work in Japan and you don't see them anywhere else. You really want to be international when it comes to digital and technology. And there's going to be a temptation to sort of pull back within the borders from China's perspective. And I think that's probably a mistake long term, but it may be necessary in the short term.
Now, we see from Intel to Oracle to Microsoft to Apple to many other tech companies of the United States, multinationals working global market. China is one of the important components of the global market. If that market is not going to be there, or it's going to be much further complicated as a result of actions and interactions between China and U.S. politics, what would that mean for these global companies?
Yes, so American tech companies are the most international of the tech companies. Often China is one of the few geographies that they're not as articulated in. The hardware companies certainly are, the software companies sometimes a bit less. But Microsoft or Oracle certainly very active all over the world, including in China. We are more dependent on foreign nations for our market and our growth than almost anyone else. So it's, again, one of these strange kind of decisions of the present administration to shake up a world order where you were on top. And you don't really need to be a genius to know that if there's 52 decks in a card and you're the top card in the deck, right, 52 cards in the deck, if you shuffle, you're the one most likely to fall in your status in the deck. So I think this idea that you have to be nationalistic about your tech companies is particularly damaging to the American tech behemoths, which have been a bright spot in our economy here, have been a bright spot in our innovation economy for many years, and are the backbone of our stock markets. So the indexes which we like to celebrate are 20, 30, 40% comprised of these companies. So I think we've put all our eggs in the basket and then pushed it down the stairs despite some of our economic rivals, and I couldn't imagine a worse timing for a more dangerous policy.
But Mr. Wolf, does the administration really care? Because some of my American friends have been telling me the priority is the election, and therefore national interest is a totally another thing. But the question also is the American system, given its complexity and its efficiency, I was told, why couldn't do something about it when the interests of many, shall I say, American tech companies could be impacted negatively as a result of the aggressive actions taken by the UN administration toward the Chinese tech companies, which as a result, of course, will have some Chinese interactions and also tit for tat.
I mean, I think we see the evolution of big American tech companies, historically not particularly close to this president, by the way, so he may not be upset about giving them a hard time. A lot of the larger tech companies here have not been historically sort of Trump supporters. But I think you see a lot of American companies in the last few years make very narrow decisions about wanting regulatory relief here or there, or tax advantages here or there, and they became very short-sighted in terms of the bigger geostrategic. So if you can't earn most of the money, who cares what your tax rate is? Or if you're not paying the taxes, you're not earning the money. And I think American corporations, like American voters, have to ask some difficult questions. And I say, look, clearly, in any democracy, ours very imperfect democracy that we have here, like everywhere else, there's going to be a certain amount of role playing around the elections. But there's 365 days in the year, and there's 4 years between election cycles. So you don't want to be looking at just one day out of thousands, obviously. And look, it's very short-sighted policies. We hope that the checks and balances that we have, and that the greater good and the interests of our leading corporations can prevail over the narrow electoral games or gains that can be made by a single candidate in a single day of an election year. It's obviously not the best practice.
Mr. Liu, from your perspective, how do you see the prospect of ByteDance working further on the TikTok business, whether it's in the U.S. or elsewhere in the world, given there is competition for sale already quite loud in the media reports?
Even if this deal be approved, then what happens to their international, the ByteDance, the international policies, right? It still be a very huge challenge. Right now it's just at the United States, but what's the next step? They still have the international market outside of the U.S. in the European Unions or the U.S. allies, Canada, Australia. So, is there another round of this kind of events? The ByteDance, from their perspective, they're facing the choices whether to continue to their international expansions in the near term. So this is not just the ByteDance, it's also for other China's tech companies, the future.
There's a Chinese idiom for that. Once you're bitten by a snake, you will always be concerned whether there are snakes in the grass. I guess that's very true for many Chinese tech companies, whether they're social media, they're social media entertainment companies or others. So what would be the best advice you give, given the uncertainties all businesses face these days, particularly Chinese tech companies these days?
Right. I mean, if you have to kind of go business by business and just ask what is politically or culturally sensitive, which major media companies are culturally important in every country, like TikTok. And then, decide if you're going to go it alone, open yourself, or if you're going to go through a local partner. We can see companies like Didi doing quite well. Didi's in Brazil, Didi's in Mexico, Didi's expanding across Asia, either directly or through local partners like Grab. Alibaba is doing well in e-commerce. They're expanding their logistics network into Europe, into Southeast Asia. Lazada is owned by Alibaba, which is a major player here in Thailand. Companies that are maybe thinking about this more than they were 2 months. Probably Ant Financial, which has just filed to go public, because financial services tends to be highly regulated. Web services might be a little bit more sensitive than it was, but everyone's kind of readjusting their thinking on, am I going to go it alone? Am I going to find a local partner and be a minority shareholder in, say, a major company in India, as opposed to doing it myself? And business people are good at that. I mean, this is right in the strike zone of most CEOs. So it's just, the landscape has shifted under the feet of everybody, but we're all fast on our feet, so it'll be fine.
We hope we'll be fine. Another thing is about the latest bidding, whether it is Microsoft teamed up with Walmart, or whether it is Oracle joining in or other candidates. We do not know yet what are the real picture because they are negotiations. But along the way, how should we see the nature of TikTok given the turbulence it is experiencing? Meanwhile, what should be the most important principles in these negotiations? Mr. Wolf.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think whenever you force a company to fire sell off in a very public manner and you restrict the number of buyers, you are acting in a way to illegitimately reduce the value of a company. So I think whoever buys it has to decide what taint might follow. I also think that the regulatory community in China may take a look at who is the buyer here, who's kind of feasting on the misfortune, and may have ideas about kind of disciplining the international companies that go in that direction. One, and then two, I think the story here is that if a fairly innocuous, fairly non-threatening technology gets this much negative attention, people are going to have to ask the more difficult question, which is, what is it that the U.S. regulators don't like? Is it the success of TikTok, or is it a national security matter? If it's a success, then you don't want to go to the United States and build a business to be successful principally in the United States if you're a foreign or a Chinese company. And that would have a terrible effect on employment trends, investment trends, and integration between the first and second largest economy in the world.
Mr. Townsend, what are likely to be some of the most important factors you are going to watch in those behind-the-scenes negotiations?
Right. This was pretty stable up until a couple days ago when the Chinese government added this to their export rules, which was a major move. I mean, it was really very, very interesting. So they've kind of let everybody know, there's another party at the table here. It's not just Microsoft, Walmart, TikTok, and the Trump administration. The Chinese government's at the table and is going to ultimately sign off or not on this. So that was kind of a big deal in the last couple of days. Everyone kind of knew where this was going, that Walmart actually is the most natural acquirer probably for TikTok. The irony here, which is not being discussed, is Walmart buying TikTok would be very analogous to the recent Douyin deal with Suning here in China. It's actually a copy of a China strategy for Walmart to do this, unlike something we've seen in the U.S. before. So that was kind of interesting. So probably the biggest factor going forward is going to be the election. And I think this whole thing is going to get delayed until after the election. And the Chinese government can do that very easily now.
Okay. Mr. Liu, also your thought.
People want to have more time to make the more reasonable decision after the election, because election is make everything complicated, and sometimes in some sense it's nationalism concerns over there. I think that after the China update is Chinese government get involved, so there's going to be a chance to delay this decision, and it will be good for all the parties, two governments and sellers and buyers.
Lu Chuanying, Jeffrey Townsend, Max Wolf, thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. Really appreciate it. Thank you. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program today. Scathing words from a longtime American China hand on Trump policy with China. The full interview with David Lampton after the break.
The difficulties we're having now, I hope and I believe, are going to be an unfortunate period, but not the main historical trend.
And you're watching World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. Next up, our Pathfinder special series on China-U.S. relations, and many who have been contributing to the relations over the past 4 decades. The more aggressive the current U.S. administration takes up the mantle of protectionism, the bigger the strain on China-U.S. ties. The political uncertainty even spilled over to academic and people-to-people exchanges, with a Trump executive order ending the Fulbright program in China. Similar programs like the Peace Corps also axed its China program earlier this year. And the latest news suggests that U.S. Secretary of State claimed President Trump is weighing restricting Chinese students from studying in the country, adding they are likely to announce the new actions against Beijing in the coming weeks or months. And threats like this are happening every day from Washington. Could relations get any worse between the two countries? I asked that question and many other more to David Lampton, one of the most respected voices on China from the U.S. He's also former president of the National Committee on U.S.-China relations. He was one of the earliest Fulbrighters to visit China. He said some of the U.S. decisions made recently are just the latest in an extended line of self-defeating moves that will weaken America's infrastructure of global cultural influence. Let's take a listen.
Well, the Fulbright program, which was founded in 1947 in the United States came out of World War II and wanted to build relations with as many nations as possible, and thought American universities and professors and students both going abroad to exchange knowledge and to bring foreign students, scholars, researchers, and language teachers to the United States would increase American soft power, but more than just soft power and international competition. I think Americans believe, and I certainly believe, that attracting the best brains in the world helps American innovation and us to be a more productive society. So I would say the two big reasons are peace and prosperity.
Let's take a look at the numbers, because the numbers sometimes tell us a lot about the facts. Up to 390,000 Fulbrighters came from all over 160 countries and regions since the program began in 1947 in the United States. Records show of the total number of participants in 2017, 175 are from the Chinese mainland and 19 are from Hong Kong of China. And the number may not be high, but there is many other similar programs for exchanges. We have seen Peace Corps, for example. In the last 25 years, more than 1,300 American volunteers have completed their 2-year assignments at more than 140 universities and colleges across China. Peter Hessler is only one of those examples, author of Rivertown, and Evan Osnos, an American journalist from The New Yorker, both joined this program. These are just the sporadic cases out of a huge group. Now, in China, Schwarzman College at Tsinghua University is operated a little differently. In a class of 2020, it has students from 38 countries with 40% from the United States, a fifth from China, 40% from the rest of the world. We also have the Yanjing scholars with the Peking University as well. Professor, what I want to say is, are we going to see a U.S. ever more withdrawing from its engagement, both with China and the rest of the world, and a China apparently very active to engage with the United States and also the other countries?
Well, I think I would answer your question by saying no, I do not think we will see that for a long period in the future. In other words, the difficulties we're having now, I hope and I believe, are going to be, in retrospect, unfortunate period, but not the main historical trend. But I would say something that's more important. It's one thing for me to say I'm optimistic or not. I'm optimistic about the future. But one strength I believe the United States has is not everything here depends on the central government. In fact, not everything depends on local government. And in the educational realm, it's a particularly decentralized situation here. So, for example, the first time I went to do research for 6 months in China in 1982, I went to Wuhan University,
Yes.
which had a school-to-school relationship with my university called Ohio State University. And as far as I would know, our central government had virtually nothing to do with that. There are hundreds and hundreds of bilateral university-to-university agreements. My own school of Johns Hopkins has had for 30 plus years a center that at Nanjing University that it runs in joint partnership, and I trust and hope it will be successful for another 30 years. Similarly, my school, SAIS, Johns Hopkins here, has a program with Tsinghua in which SAIS students go to Tsinghua. Tsinghua students come to SAIS. They've been some of the best students that both schools have. So I would say while the direction of what you might call federal policy, our central government policy, is very unfortunate, I would say indeed reckless. Mercifully, the U.S. doesn't depend entirely on its central government. And as long as American universities and other educational institutions see opportunities in China to gain mutual benefit, they will continue unless the central government prohibits it. And my guess is that the central government, short of conflict between our two nations, would not do that.
A lot of people do not necessarily understand the significance of academic exchanges, the significance of student exchanges, and cultural exchanges. Maybe you could tell us about your personal story that would enlighten us about how we have managed after decades of efforts to be where we are today, at least between China and the United States. Professor, I know you were in Hong Kong and then on the mainland. Tell me more about that.
Well, the first time that I went to, we'll call it Greater China, was in 1972-73 as a Fulbright scholar. I went to Hong Kong to interview Chinese people, many of whom during the Cultural Revolution and earlier in history had gone to Hong Kong. And American scholars such as myself could not go to China. It was prohibited by our government. My first passport had a list of prohibited countries, one of which was the People's Republic of China. So the nearest I could get to China to study it and talk to Chinese people was in Hong Kong. I learned a lot. It was about, I did a study, it was my dissertation, became a book on the politics of medicine in China. And what I believed and what I believe now is, of course, it's important what our central leaders do, whether it's Donald Trump or President Xi or whatever. Central leaders matter. But when I went into the field, everybody was studying central leaders and central party meetings. And my view was that how governments meet the basic needs of their people at the grassroots level is a very important part of politics. And therefore, I wanted to look how it was that a relatively poor China in 1972-73 was able to provide a much better level of public health for its people than many other developing countries at a similar income level. And China over time did a very good job. And I wanted to tell the story about how China managed to have a better health circumstance than it had in many other regards. So I believe you need to walk on two intellectual legs. One is you need to understand the top of society, but you also need to understand where government meets society at the grassroots level. And the only place I could, at that time, really find out the kind of information and personal experience was by interviewing people in Hong Kong.
Very interesting experience. And then a few years later, you struggled your way into China, the People's Republic of China, which you said on the page of your passport was very long time being forbidden. 1976, Professor.
I was a part of a science group that was going to China to talk about steroid chemistry. Steroid chemistry has at that time had a lot to do with birth control pills and birth control policy. And I went with the National Academy of Sciences group because I was one of the few Americans who had looked at China's medical system, as I just explained when I was in Hong Kong. So the National Academy, our National Academy of Sciences, asked me to join this group, and we went to China in 1976. But we had to enter China a month after Mao had passed away. China at that particular time, and this always left a deep, the transition to the next generation of leaders was not yet clear. And as we traveled around China from Beijing down to Guilin to Shanghai, the new transition, new power structure gradually emerged. So I've always felt that I saw China firsthand. And I think that's one of the things that I think maybe younger people in both of our countries do not fully appreciate. And that is how expensive our conflict, China and America's conflict, were in the 1950s and 60s. And we've had 40 years of peace, rapid economic growth. Both of our countries have improved. And the long and the short of it is that engagement for both of our people has been a tremendous success. It's had problems all along. It has serious problems now, I think the worst problem since 1972. But our younger people ought to appreciate what the costs of bad U.S.-China relations can be. Enormous.
Thank you, Professor, for sharing that part of the experience and your insights about history. But people could say, well, you know, Professor Lampton, those stories are old. Those stories are coming out of the time when China and the United States were hand in hand, or at least in the process of coming hand in hand. But now look at the situation has dramatically changed, and therefore your story does not provide any of the reference to us anymore, some would argue, Professor Lampton.
Well, I'm sure you're correct, and young people always have the sort of to come to terms with in what respect do we pay attention to the experience of our elders, and to what extent do we look at a new situation with new means at our disposal and adapt to the new situation, even if it isn't fully consistent with what an older generation might have done. I guess I call that the process of living. But I think we all know that there is some role for experience.
Yeah.
And I think anybody who has that response would just or who might think in the way you described should ask themselves, during the Cold War between the United States and China, where, from the United States point of view and from China's viewpoint, what were the two biggest wars of the Cold War? And the answer was Korea and Vietnam. And they both those wars involved China as well as, in the one case, Korea and the other, Vietnam. In the 40 years plus after normalization, we've had no wars or conflict. That doesn't mean we won't in the future. It doesn't mean that we don't have serious problems now, which some people are very, I would say, immoderate about. But I think the idea that war is expensive is something that's become increasingly true. During the Cold War, we only had nuclear weapons, basically, and obviously conventional weapons. But now there are many other ways in which we each can hurt each other. We can disrupt each other's supply chains. We can interrupt our educational relations. We can interrupt cyber connections upon which we're both so dependent. So I would say that my experience, yes, is old, but the wisdom of avoiding conflict is even more profound now, perhaps, than it was in the 1950s and 60s.
You talk about the young people. I'm afraid that, Professor Lampton, I have to remind you, many of those who are talking about this Cold War mentality are not necessarily young people inside the United States, but rather
Right.
some of those policymakers in their 70s and 60s. And some suggest that there is a danger of applying the Cold War mentality, particularly the playbook against the former Soviet Union now, to China by the United States. What do you make of that discussion?
Well, I agree with pretty much what you said. And that is that no generalization is perfect. And my statement about younger people did not mean to apply to all younger people, because young people have a variety of views in both our countries as well. And certainly I would not suggest that older people can't have very counterproductive foreign policy views. I think if you look at the upper echelons of Washington, you'll find quite a few people my age with my color hair. And they're not all pursuing a very wise course, and as you would say, have the Cold War playbook firmly in mind. But I think you're going to see that the U.S. is a resilient society. Winston Churchill had a statement, I think, about Americans. And of course, Churchill had ties to the United States, family ties. He says, you know, I love the Americans. They always right after they exhaust every other possibility. In short, we're capable of making a lot of mistakes. And frankly, I would say China is too. But we have corrective mechanisms. And I may be wrong, but I think you're going to see a very great display of a corrective mechanism on November 3rd.
David Lampton. And that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, you can certainly search our program, World Insight, or you can check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook, or follow my accounts as well. I'm Tian Wei on behalf of the team. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.